In this video, I'm making a cylindrical keepsake case. I made one of these as a wedding gift for my wife's cousin who got married in December of last year. The top comes off, and inside you can store a marriage certificate, birth certificate, or anything else of similar size. It turned out really well, and I thought it would be a really nice thing to make for my wife and I. So let's get on with the build. I'm making this piece from a chestnut turning blank. I started out by marking the centres on each end of the blank so that I could mount it on the lathe correctly. Once on the lathe, I turned the square blank down into a cylinder. The blank was originally about 53mm square, and by the time I'd finished turning it, it was around 49mm, so I did not lose too much material. I then gave it a rough sand to even it all out. Now that I'd finished turning the cylinder, I removed the drive centre and replaced it with a chuck. I measured 70mm in from one end and made a cut. This smaller piece would become the lid of the case. I then marked the centre of the freshly cut end, remounted the body of the case on the lathe, and set up a 30mm Forstner bit to begin boring the hole. I'm using saw-toothed Forstner bit for this instead of a flat profile, as these are much better for cutting through end grain. I then started to slowly bore the hole, taking care not to let too much heat build up and to regularly clear out the swarf. Once I drilled down as far as I could with the standard Forstner bit, I added an extension bar to allow me to drill the remainder of the hole. I drilled the main hole to a depth of 16cm. With the main hole now drilled, I started to pare back the end of the case so that the lid has something to push onto. The hole in the cap will be 35mm, so I frequently checked with some calipers to make sure I did not go too far. Unfortunately, while doing the paring, I had a catch on the edge of the piece, which caused a pretty big chip. To mitigate this, I continued turning the lip down to the correct diameter, then took another 10mm or so off of the body, which removed the chip. I drilled a 35mm hole into a piece of scrap wood and then sanded the lip down until I got a good fit in that hole. I needed to use a parting tool to get a nice 45-degree angle between the lip and the body of the piece. The hole in the lid was then drilled to a depth of 20mm. I then assembled the case on the lathe and sanded it from 100 up to 240 grit to remove any tool marks and also to make the seam between the cap and the main body as smooth as possible. Okay, that's most of the turning done now. I'm pretty happy with how this is looking. Because of the mistake I made on the inner lip, I have lost about 10mm of length over the main body of the piece. That has affected the grain matching a little bit, but I'm not too concerned about that because there's still fairly good grain continuation along the whole length of the piece. So all in all, I'm pretty happy with it. I'm going to be doing a laser engraving on this next. I appreciate that's not going to be everybody's cup of tea, so I'm covering that in a separate video, which I'll put a link to on the screen. If that is something you're interested in, head over and have a look. I'll be covering how I did the engraving in a lot more detail. Once the engraving's been done, there's going to be some residual smoke left on the piece. So I want to get that done now before we go on to finishing so that I can get all that cleaned off. I'll also be trimming the ends of the piece, as we've got the mark from the live centre on this end and we've got some jaw marks on this end, but there's enough, the hole's not that deep, so I can trim off these ends pretty safely without exposing the inner hole which has been drilled through the middle. So I'm going to crack on with that now and let's get this finished. Before trimming the ends, I gave the entire piece another sanding to remove the residue left over from the engraving. I then trimmed about 10mm off of each end. I then mounted each piece on the lathe to give it its final sanding up to 800 grit. Then for each piece, I added 2 coats of sanding sealer, 1 coat of Danish oil, and 2 coats of friction polish. I gave each coat time to dry before adding the next, and I denibbed between each coat with 800 grit sandpaper. This left me with an incredibly smooth finish which was almost like glass. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you have any feedback at all, I'd love to hear it. Just drop a comment on the video and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you've enjoyed watching this, then please consider subscribing to my channel for more weekly woodworking projects. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.